The Golden Madness, California, 1848 to 1855. Prologue: The Silent Edge of the World. Before the madness, there was only silence. In early 1848, California was a ghost on the map, a distant and neglected province on the far edge of the Mexican-American War. It was a land of staggering beauty, rolling golden hills, ancient redwood forests, and a fog-shrouded coast that few outsiders had ever seen. The population was a sparse scattering of Californios, Mexican cattle ranchers, and a handful of eccentric American drifters who had left civilization behind. There were no cities, no laws, and no banks. San Francisco was not yet a metropolis. It was a muddy, wind-swept village called Yerba Buena, home to barely 800 people, where ships stopped only to load cowhides before sailing away. The world had no reason to look at California. It was the end of the earth. But deep within the granite veins of the Sierra Nevada mountains, a geological time bomb had been waiting for millions of years, ready to explode and change human history forever. Chapter 1. The Secret at the Sawmill. The spark that lit the fuse happened on a crisp, cold morning, January 24, 1848. James Marshall, a moody and eccentric carpenter from New Jersey, was inspecting a ditch at a sawmill he was building for a wealthy Swiss immigrant named John Sutter. The mill sat on the South Fork of the American River in a lonely valley called Coloma. As Marshall peered into the tail race, the channel where water flowed away from the water wheel, something caught his eye. It was a flicker of metallic yellow, roughly the size of a pea, resting on the bedrock beneath the clear, freezing water. Marshall reached down and picked it up. It was heavy. He bit it, and the metal bent softly under his teeth. He pounded it between two rocks, and it didn't shatter. It flattened. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he was holding pure gold. Marshall rode back to the fort to show John Sutter. The two men tested the metal in secret, boiling it in lye and weighing it against silver coins. It was real. But instead of celebrating, John Sutter was terrified. Sutter was a man with a vision. He wanted to build an agricultural empire, a feudal state called New Helvetia, where he would rule over crops and cattle. He knew that if the world found out about the gold, his workers would vanish, his crops would rot, and his land would be overrun by a tidal wave of greedy strangers. They made a pact of silence. They would tell no one. They would finish the sawmill, quietly gather the gold, and keep the world out. But secrets in 1848 were impossible to keep, especially when alcohol was involved. One of Sutter's workers, a woman named Jenny Wimmer, who cooked for the camp, began bragging about the yellow metal the boys were finding in the river. She even used a nugget to buy supplies from a passing traveler. The rumors began to trickle down the mountain, whispering through the pine trees and reaching the ear of a man who would become the true architect of the gold rush, Sam Brannan. Sam Brannan was a renegade Mormon elder and a brilliant, unscrupulous businessman who owned a general store at Sutter's fort. When he heard the rumors, he didn't grab a shovel. He grabbed his inventory ledger. Brannan understood something that Marshall and Sutter did not. The real money wasn't in the gold. It was in the mining supplies. Quietly, methodically, Brannan traveled up and down the coast, buying every pickaxe, shovel, and tin pan in California. He cornered the market completely. Once he owned every tool a miner would need, he decided it was time to let the secret out. On May 12, 1848, Sam Brannan returned to San Francisco. He didn't just whisper the news, he screamed it. Walking through the muddy streets of Portsmouth Square, he held a quinine bottle filled with gold dust high above his head. "Gold!" he bellowed to the shocked crowd. "Gold! Gold from the American River!" It was the most successful marketing stunt in history. The town of San Francisco went insane. Within days, the schoolhouse closed because the teacher left. The church emptied. Ships sat abandoned in the harbor as their crews deserted. The local newspaper, the Californian, was forced to shut down, printing a final desperate headline. The whole country, from San Francisco to Los Angeles, resounds with the sordid cry of gold, gold, gold. The rush had begun, and the silence of the West was broken forever.
Chapter 2. The World Rushes In. If Sam Brannan's shout in Portsmouth Square was the spark, the official confirmation from Washington, D.C. was the gasoline. For months, the rumors of California gold drifted eastward like a slow fever, dismissed by East Coast newspapers as tall tales from the wild frontier. But that skepticism vanished instantly on December 5, 1848, when President James K. Polk stood before Congress and declared that the accounts of gold abundance were of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by the authentic reports. That single sentence triggered the largest mass migration in human history. Suddenly, farmers dropped their plows, doctors abandoned their patients, and clerks walked out of their offices in the middle of the workday. They were no longer citizens of their towns. They were Argonauts, named after the Greek heroes searching for the golden fleece, and they were all infected by a singular, consuming madness: gold fever. By the spring of 1849, the world was on the move, but getting to California was a gauntlet of death. The 49ers faced three impossible choices, each with its own unique nightmare. The first route was by sea around Cape Horn at the tip of South America. It was a 15,000-mile voyage that took up to 8 months. Men were crammed into rotting whaling ships, surviving on worm-infested hardtack and stagnant water, tossing and turning through the terrifying storms of the Southern Ocean, where waves rose as high as cathedrals. Many went insane from the sheer boredom and confinement, arriving in San Francisco Bay as hollowed-out shells of the men who had left Boston or New York. The second option was the shortcut through the Isthmus of Panama. Argonauts would sail to the Atlantic side of Panama, hike through the dense, steaming jungle to the Pacific, and catch a ship north. It sounded efficient on paper, but in reality, it was a tropical death trap. Men in wool suits slogged through swamps teeming with mosquitoes, carrying malaria and yellow fever. Those who survived the trek found themselves stranded on the Pacific beaches of Panama City, waiting weeks or even months for ships that were already full, watching their friends die in the humid heat while clutching their useless tickets. The third route was the Overland Trail, a 2,000-mile march across the Great Plains and the deadly deserts of the West. This was not a romantic cowboy adventure. It was a graveyard. The trail was lined with the bloating carcasses of oxen and the shallow graves of pioneers struck down by cholera, a disease that could kill a healthy man between breakfast and dinner. They had to cross the baking salt flats of Utah and scale the vertical granite walls of the Sierra Nevada before the winter snows trapped them, just as the Donner Party had been trapped only a few years prior. Yet despite the terror, 90,000 people arrived in California in 1849 alone. When these survivors finally stumbled into San Francisco, they found a place that defied logic. The sleepy village of Yerba Buena had vanished, replaced by a chaotic canvas city of tents and shanties that seemed to change shape every hour. It was a global melting pot unlike anything the world had ever seen. There were Hawaiians, or Kanakas, Peruvians, Chileans, Chinese, French, and Australians, all mixing in the muddy streets. Gold dust was the only currency that mattered. A single egg cost the equivalent of $25 today, and renting a small space to sleep could cost a fortune. It was a man's city,
97% of the population was male, and it was a city without rules, driven by greed, adrenaline, and the intoxicating belief that the ground beneath their feet could turn a pauper into a king overnight.
Chapter 3: The Lottery of the River. Once the Argonauts survived the journey and made their way inland to the Sierra foothills, they were met with a brutal, heartbreaking reality. The easy gold, the nuggets James Marshall had simply picked up off the ground, was largely gone. What remained was a game of agonizing labor and blind chance, played out in freezing, glacier-fed streams under a baking sun. This was placer mining, and it was less about adventure and more about moving mountains of dirt one shovelful at a time. Men spent 12 hours a day standing waist-deep in icy water, their backs bent double, washing endless pans of gravel in the hopes of seeing a tiny color, flecks of gold dust in the black sand. Their hands cracked and bled, their skin peeled from sunburn, and their bodies were racked with dysentery and scurvy. The psychology of the mines was even harder to endure than the labor. It was a literal lottery. A miner could dig for weeks and find nothing but dirt, while the greenhorn 10 feet away might turn over a single rock and find a nugget the size of a hen's egg. This randomness bred a dangerous, paranoid atmosphere. Trust evaporated. Men slept with their revolvers under their pillows and their gold pouches tied to their bodies. The camaraderie of the trail was replaced by a jealous, feverish competition. The mining camps that sprang up overnight reflected this chaos. They had names that sounded like warnings: Hangtown, Hell's Delight, Gouge Eye, and Murderer's Bar. These weren't towns. They were temporary explosions of canvas and rough timber, populated entirely by desperate young men fueled by bad whiskey and loneliness. There were no sheriffs, no jails, and no courts. Disputes were settled by the fist, the Bowie knife, or the Colt revolver. As 1849 bled into 1850, the surface gold became harder to find, and the mood in the camps turned dark and ugly. When the gold was plentiful, the miners tolerated the international melting pot. But as the rivers dried up, tolerance was replaced by vicious xenophobia. American miners, feeling a sense of manifest destiny, began to view the gold as their God-given property, stolen by foreign interlopers. The first victims were the experienced Sonoran miners from Mexico and the Chileans, who were often far better at finding gold than the Americans. In 1850, the California legislature passed the Foreign Miners Tax, a crushing fee designed to drive non-Americans out of the mines. Violence soon followed the legislation. Mobs of white miners raided Latin American camps, burning tents and whipping occupants. But the most sustained hatred was reserved for the Chinese. By 1852, over 20,000 Chinese immigrants had arrived, calling California Gold Mountain. They were industrious, sober, and often willing to work the tailings, claims that white miners had already abandoned. When these abandoned claims yielded gold, the white mobs retaliated with pogroms, burning Chinese camps and cutting off their queues, or braids. The rivers, once a symbol of hope, were becoming sites of systematic persecution. The easy days were over. The golden dream was beginning to curdle into a nightmare of greed and racial violence, and the chaos of the camps was about to spill over into the great metropolis by the bay.
Chapter 4: The City of Fire. While the miners fought for scraps in the mountains, San Francisco had mutated into a monstrosity of canvas and wood, a city that seemed to exist on the edge of the apocalypse. By 1850, it was the most dangerous place on Earth. The harbor was a ghostly forest of rotting masts, clogged with hundreds of abandoned ships whose crews had deserted for the mines. On shore, the city was a labyrinth of gambling dens, brothels, and warehouses piled high with goods from every corner of the globe. It was a place where a man could lose a fortune at a faro table in 10 minutes, or be murdered for his boots in the muddy alleyways. The law was non-existent. The police force was hopelessly corrupt, and the courts were a joke. In this vacuum of authority, a criminal gang known as the Sydney Ducks, hardened ex-convicts from the penal colonies of Australia, began to rule the streets of the waterfront district, terrifying the populace and operating with total impunity. But the true terror of San Francisco was not the crime, it was the fire. Between December 1849 and June 1851, the city burned to the ground 6 separate times. These were not accidental blazes. They were infernos fanned by the relentless ocean winds that whipped through the canvas tents and hastily built redwood shacks. The most devastating of these, the Great Fire of May 1851, destroyed 3/4 of the city in a single night. The heat was so intense that it melted the iron shutters of warehouses and turned the plank roads into rivers of fire. Yet as the city burned, the Sydney Ducks and other gangs didn't help, they looted. They smashed open the doors of burning stores, carrying off silks, liquor, and gold while the owners fled for their lives. It became an open secret that the fires were being set intentionally, a form of arson-fueled plunder that threatened to wipe the city off the map permanently. The breaking point came in June 1851. The citizens, exhausted by the ashes and the anarchy, decided that if the government wouldn't protect them, they would protect themselves. The catalyst was the theft of a safe by a Sydney Duck named John Jenkins. He was caught by a group of merchants, but instead of handing him over to the corrupt sheriff, they rang the fire bell, not to signal a blaze, but to summon the mob. That night, Sam Brannan, the man who had started the gold rush, climbed atop a mound of sand and shouted, "We are the mayor! We are the hangman! We are the law!" The crowd roared its approval, and the Committee of Vigilance was born. In a scene that would define the ruthless justice of the West, the Vigilance Committee put Jenkins on trial in the middle of the night. It was a kangaroo court, held in a warehouse, fueled by anger and fear. At 2 a.m., the verdict was delivered, guilty. They didn't wait for dawn. The mob marched Jenkins to the Customs House in Portsmouth Square, threw a rope over the beam of an adobe building, and hauled him up by his neck as the moonlight shone on the silent, watching crowd. It was a grim turning point. The hanging of John Jenkins signaled that the chaotic freedom of the early gold rush was ending. The Argonauts were realizing that building a civilization required blood, and that the only way to tame the madness they had unleashed was with a rope. San Francisco would rise from the ashes again, this time built of brick and stone, guarded by men who were willing to kill to keep order.
Chapter 5. The Hydraulic Beast. By 1853, the romance of the lone miner was dead. The easy gold in the stream beds had been picked clean, leaving thousands of men destitute and desperate. The era of the tin pan and the shovel was over. If men wanted more gold, they would have to take it from the ancient riverbeds buried deep inside the mountains themselves. But moving millions of tons of earth required more than muscle. It required a monster. That monster arrived in the form of a terrifying new technology invented by Connecticut carpenter Edward Madison: hydraulic mining. It was a method of total war against the earth. Miners built massive networks of wooden flumes that snaked for miles high into the Sierras, capturing melting snowmelt and channeling it down the mountainsides. Gravity did the work. As the water plummeted thousands of vertical feet, it built up incredible explosive pressure. At the bottom, this water was fed into iron cannons called monitors. When the nozzle was open, a jet of water shot out with such terrifying velocity that it could kill a man instantly if he stepped in front of it. The result was awe-inspiring and horrific. Miners aimed these water cannons at the hillsides, blasting away centuries of soil, trees, and boulders in seconds. Entire ancient forests were uprooted and tossed aside like matchsticks. The mountains melted into a slurry of mud and gravel, which was then run through massive sluice boxes to catch the gold. It was incredibly effective. One hydraulic mine could extract more gold in a week than 1,000 men with pans could find in a year. But the cost was the total annihilation of the landscape. The Sierra Nevada foothills, once lush and green, were stripped down to skeletal white bedrock, leaving scars that are still visible from space today. The consequences of this hydraulic beast flowed downstream. The millions of tons of mud and debris, known as slickens, didn't just disappear. They washed into the Feather, Yuba, and American rivers, turning crystal-clear waterways into thick brown sludge. The riverbeds rose higher and higher, clogging the channels. When the spring rains came, the rivers, choked with mining debris, burst their banks. The victims were the farmers in the Central Valley below. Cities like Marysville and Sacramento were repeatedly inundated not just with water, but with feet of sticky, heavy mining sludge that buried orchards, destroyed wheat fields, and ruined livelihoods. A bitter, violent class war erupted between the mountain miners, who drove the state's economy, and the valley farmers, who fed the state's people. It was the first major environmental disaster in American history, a conflict that proved the gold rush was no longer a heroic adventure. It had become a ruthless industrial machine, willing to wash away the very face of California to squeeze out the last ounce of profit.
Chapter 6. The End of the Dream. In 1855, the fever broke. The manic energy that had driven the world to California for 7 years suddenly ran into the cold, hard wall of economics. The placer gold was gone. The riverbanks were stripped, and the independent miner was an endangered species, replaced by wage laborers working for massive hydraulic corporations. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't a lack of gold, it was a lack of trust. On February 17, 1855, the news hit San Francisco like a thunderclap. The grand banking house of Page, Bacon & Co. in St. Louis had collapsed. The panic traveled instantly down the telegraph lines and onto the steamers. When the news reached San Francisco, the city plunged into the panic of 1855. It was a financial bloodbath. In a single day, terrified depositors stormed the banks, demanding their gold dust back. One by one, the great financial institutions that had fueled the boom shuttered their doors. Construction stopped, real estate values plummeted, and the flush times evaporated overnight. The streets of San Francisco, once paved with optimism and reckless spending, were suddenly filled with unemployed men and shuttered storefronts. The party was over. The tragedy of the gold rush is best told through the fates of the two men who started it. John Sutter, who once dreamed of an agricultural empire called New Helvetia, was ruined. The rush he tried to suppress had destroyed him. Squatters had overrun his land, stolen his cattle, and trampled his crops. His fort was left to rot. He spent the rest of his life as a bitter, broken man, wandering the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C., endlessly petitioning the government for reimbursement for the theft of his property. He died in a Pennsylvania hotel room in 1880, still waiting for a check that never came. James Marshall, the carpenter who pulled the first flake from the tail race, fared no better. He never profited from his discovery. He drifted through the hills, hounded by strangers who believed he had a supernatural power to find gold and would follow him everywhere he went, forcing him to live in isolation. He turned to the bottle to drown his resentment. He died alone in a small, drafty cabin in 1885, penniless. In a final cruel irony, the state that had ignored him in life erected a bronze statue of him pointing to the spot where he found the gold, a monument to a discovery that had ruined his life. Yet, while the individuals perished, the result of their madness remained. In less than a decade,
California had been fast-forwarded from a quiet frontier to a global powerhouse. It had become the 31st state in record time, skipping the territorial phase entirely. The gold rush had decimated the indigenous population, destroyed the environment, and ruined thousands of lives, but it also built the American West. It created a society based on risk, reinvention, and the relentless pursuit of the future, a DNA that still defines California today. The gold was gone, but the Golden State had just begun.